we're going to take a closer look today. Now, I want to start by looking at what is the director, trying to define this in a way that makes sense to us, because a lot of us might feel that we're familiar with this role in a cinematic sense, but in theater, it is quite different. So the role of the director in the theater is really, it's interesting when you look at these three words: facilitate the process, inspire your collaborators, and coordinate everything. So by one token, all three of those words are very broad. You can tell just by how vague it is that a director works with everyone on a project. So you can't be incredibly specific when you're talking about just their overall role and function in a theatrical process. And at the same time, because of that broad application, it's also kind of intangible. A lot of what the director's function is on a process isn't as measurable as, say, okay, if I am, sewing this garment, okay, well, I've done the stitch correctly, I have completed it. It's a much more tangible, measurable way to know whether I'm succeeding or failing at doing this. But the director sometimes doesn't know until the very end, and even then might have different perspectives on that. So as we evaluate today what the director is providing, what kind of training they need, breaking down these functions, I want to demystify it. I think it's important to start from this place and say, yes, a director's role is it's gargantuan, but you can break it down into measurable steps. And so we're going to look at later in the presentation, okay, well, how can anyone do this? How do you learn enough to be able to successfully collaborate with so many different people? But for now, we're just looking at, okay, so what do they do? And really, that's, in a strange way, that's it. They just have to facilitate, inspire, and coordinate. Now, of course, I'm almost understating things. It's just that, again, because it applies to so many different parts of this process, that's really what it comes down to. And I want to look at this quote that's included in your textbook, I think twice even. But really, it's not the director's responsibility to produce results, but rather to create the circumstances in which something might happen. So even by the name alone, director, I think a lot of people tend to gravitate toward terms like dictate or dictator. But in fact, a director should be a very open, collaborative source. And as we see from this quote by Anne Bogart, their job is to make people feel safe, is to, again, facilitate a creative process for all different kinds of artists, and try to steer the ship in the right direction at the end of the day. And so, again, we're going to break it down into some tangible things, but overall, and as we start to look at what are the qualities that make a good director, again, we keep these pretty broad. So the role of the director is just to, they're the captain of the ship. There's a lot that goes in that process, and again, we're going to look at some more specifics, but they have their hands in a little bit of everything. And we'll see that goes all the way from the inception of a project until opening night. But now let's segue and talk about, okay, well, who gets to be a director then? If this is it, I think in this presentation, in the chapter, when you first start diving in, it seems monumental. And hopefully by the end you see, it's actually, a pretty doable process. But for skills, for the actual skill set, since those first words we looked at, facilitate, inspire, because those are, again, are kind of vague, the skills that you need to succeed that are, a little bit more hard skills, I guess I would say, as opposed to soft skills, would be knowledge of theater history. I think that's really vital, when it comes to understanding, the production history of the play that you might be doing, of maybe other ways people have solved, difficulties that you may face in your production. There's all sorts of reasons why theater history would be, and it often is vital to understand when you start tackling a project. So that is again, a little bit more measurable. And it's funny because a director, you don't always see the results of that in the same way. Again, like someone who, or a carpenter, you know that they have knowledge of their craft because of the way that they, because of whatever tool that they choose to use or how they start implementing a particular skill that they have. And in the same way, a director, if a trained eye, an untrained eye, it just looks like someone is might be making random decisions, but someone who's a little bit more informed would know, oh, that's coming from a very informed place about theater history. The second one, canonical knowledge, which just means knowledge of the existing theater canon. So being familiar with not necessarily just famous plays, but okay, who are, popular playwrights right now? Who are people that have a touchstone with my audience? Or even, again, kind of with history, do I know all of the Shakespeare plays? Am I familiar with all of August Wilson's canon of work? So making sure that it's just relevant to whatever production you happen to be tackling. Because there's also frequently references in the show that you're doing, or callbacks you can make with some design choices or acting choices. So both are very helpful. So those are more, again, a little bit more measurable. Sort of in the soft skill area, these last two that are still vitally important. First of all, effective designer communication. And I would even go as far as to say effective communication, full stop. Because if your job is facilitating, if your job is inspiring, then your job really boils down to, oh, I have to communicate. Again, similarly, if you think of a captain of a ship, a captain of a vessel isn't necessarily, whether that's an airplane or a sea vessel, they're not at the helm. They're not, they're not the one in engineering. They're the ones who they're observing and they're providing feedback. They're delegating. And all of those are things that you have to do through, yes, your observation and then effective communication. So people need to understand what you're trying to accomplish. I think effective designer communication specifically too, and again, broadly, is, and you've heard this since the very beginning of this class and will continue to throughout all of these presentations, is collaboration. Collaboration is the key to all of this. A director has more coworkers than anybody because you talk to every single designer. You have, group meetings, you have individual breakout meetings. You have to know how to talk to people. And that means not always talking to people in the same way. Some people can respond better to a sharp tone. Some people respond better to positivity. And so you have to, sort of like an educator. And what's interesting, if we look, historically at that note in your text, is that the, original term for director, it's rooted in teacher, instructor. And very similarly, you have to be flexible in how like with students, not all students have the same learning style that works for them. And similarly, I need to make sure that I'm communicating with my collaborators in a way that they can hear me and do their best work. And finally, we're going to see this come up a few times today, historical and political literacy is so important. So not just canonical knowledge of theater, but world history, because that applies to the plays that you're doing. And also, what is the political and social landscape of the world right now? You need to understand what that is so you can effectively communicate with your audience. And again, we'll come to that a little bit more later. So those are the basic skill sets that you need. And we'll see how that relates to quality. But I also want to take a bit of a look at training. What's fascinating about this, and we're going to look at a few examples from different areas, is that with directing, I would say as many people have an actual formal directing background as not. Plenty of people start out as actors or start out as playwrights or start out in design and then transition into directing later. And that's because exactly all the things that we're talking about, that you simply have to, how can I effectively communicate with all these different departments if I don't know what they're doing? if I don't understand what information they need, what information I need from them. So frequently the directing is a job that for many emerges over time, because at that point, experientially, you would have the experience of whatever your initial position was, and you've worked with other directors. You've seen how people do that effectively or ineffectively from your perspective. So that's quite a few people. And then there are also those who have very formal training. I, for instance, my undergraduate experience was with a directing specialty. I've been assistant directing forever. And, so that was part of my training as well as the actual curriculum. And then went to grad school for directing as well. And then have been professionally directing and academically directing ever since. So there are some people who do it kind of down a more formal path, but neither is more common than the other. So, and before I even give these examples, it kind of goes back to that skill set, that the skill set applies to so many different people. So the barrier to entry with directing is actually fairly low. I mean, I wouldn't say anyone can just raise their hand and say, hey, I want to direct, but if you look at very successful directors, there isn't one path or another that proves an efficacy over another, I guess is what I'll say. So I want to give a few other examples just to clarify this point, that if we look at Bob Iger, who was the former Disney CEO, so his experience, he didn't have formal training to be the Disney CEO, right? Because if you think about Disney and the brand and what that means, you would think, oh, is that going to be a storyboard artist? Is that going to be an animator in the Disney realm? Like, who represents what, Disney truly means? So Bob Iger actually is a businessman, and his original background was he was a news anchor, and then he transitioned and did menial labor at a news studio. And so he worked in television doing grunt work for a long time. And so it's fascinating to see, so again, someone who has worked from sometimes those lower levels actually have a much better perspective on how the whole works. So he worked his way up, became, it was led the ABC, and then later transitioned to Disney. So his background wasn't at all in, again, what we think of the brand, and what people connect to and thinks makes Disney great, but he had a very keen sense of business. He just had an amazing business acumen. And if you look at what he's achieved had achieved as the Disney CEO, he ushered in the historic purchase of Pixar, which has been absolutely financially transformative for the empire of Disney, and also started Disney Plus right before he stepped down. So again, you see that it's similar to directing. You don't have to have a stacked experience directly in where that field will end up to have ultimately the best perspective or the greatest success in the field that you have. And I just had another fun example. David Benioff and D.B. Weiss were showrunners of Game of Thrones. I'm a big Game of Thrones fan. And they were the showrunners and creators, but both of them, they didn't even know each other for a long time, and both started, as screenwriters, and had nothing to do with, because show running, similarly to directing, is the person who oversees everything. And especially when a multi-million-dollar show like Game of Thrones, it's just inconceivable had the scope of what that position is. And so they both started as writers. So seeing how, their background in storytelling, just the bare bones of, what does the story need to be successful, is what set them up for the best success to make all of these other aesthetic decisions, to make casting choices, to all of these other things they were best set up for because of their background in writing. And that's not to say you have to be a writer to be a showrunner. That's not to say you have to, be a news anchor to one day run Disney. It just means that directors benefit from just embracing whatever their past was. You don't have to fulfill a certain role in order to be a successful director. So that was the role of the director. And then, looking a little bit more at, what are the qualities that, that someone who listens well, again, some of those other things that we talked about, is very open, is very collaborative. Those are the things we need to see. All of those soft skills. And I don't even like the term soft skill and hard skill. Again, maybe hard skills are a little bit more measurable, and yes, you're hammering that correctly versus no, you're not. But those soft skills of effective communication, of empathy, of creating a safe environment are just as vital. So now we're going to look at a little bit more of, okay, so we know a little bit about what a director does to, on the whole. We know that they shepherd a process from beginning to end, that they are the ultimate deciders, and that they oversee everyone else. They're in charge, if you will. But what are those things? So now that we kind of know those big cosmic things, we are going to hone in and see, okay, well, how do they get to that point? How do they make these monumental decisions? How do they know what the right choices are? Well, actually, I want to demystify it a little bit, because sometimes we think it's just genius. Oh, to be a director, it's divinely assigned to me. But in fact, they do what they do because of a lot of granular text work. So let's look at a few examples. So that script analysis is the most important. And I know that you guys covered that in an earlier chapter. But I think that it's important to look at this list because, and we're going to go through all of these briefly, just as kind of a refresher on that previous chapter. But if you'll notice, almost all of these are from Aristotle's Poetics. So at the end of the day, even though we are in the modern era, even though we are far away from Aristotle, we are still focused on the same basic storytelling tenets. So a director, when they are given a text, first of all, you have to know the play better than anyone else in the process. You read it again and again and again and again and again. Now, the first time is for leisure, and actually, arguably, that first read is the most important, because that's when you make notes about what surprised me, what was most emotionally resonant, what caught me off guard, anything like that. What did I connect to in my own personal life? What did that immediately make me think of? Because ultimately, your audience, they're probably only going to see it once. And so you want to preserve. I tend to take really extensive notes my very first read through to try to remember, what is that initial experience like? And then you spend the rest of the time just reading the play over and over, at least once a day, if not more, spending so much time with it to become familiar so you can help everyone else on this process. You have to know the play best, aside from maybe the playwright. But yes, so once you've read that play time and time again, you do a formal analysis, which again, I know everyone's familiar with, but so we see dramatic action, plot, number one on Aristotle, right? Characters, again, agents of action. Those, again, we're going down the six tenets of Aristotle's Poetics. Idea, I've bolded idea and tone and mood and tempo, because those three are the ones that the director controls the most. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on those than everything else. Everything else exists, and they need to analyze that to communicate with designers. But so for instance, like my analysis of character, that is going to enable me to more effectively talk to actors. If I haven't done a character analysis for every character, how can I talk to them about what those objectives are, about what their tactics are, about, what they want, how they go after it. So I do that analysis for making sure that they're depicting them as the story needs and to help them make better acting choices. Dialogue, skipping down before I come back to the ones that are more directing heavy, that's established by the playwright. So I, as the director, wouldn't have any influence over that. But I need to analyze that so I can make sure the actors are most effectively highlighting the dialogue in a way that it should be highlighted, making sure that they understand it, making sure that they're picking up on stylistic cues, dialects, anything like that. And then the given circumstances, which we'll go over later, primarily, and spectacle, arguably, is the conduit. The analysis you do for that is the conduit for talking to designers about the process. So idea, tone and mood, and tempo, those three are really where the director reigns. So we're going to visit those when we get there. So again, dramatic action, you guys already did your, Freytag triangles. You understand exposition, rising action, all of those things. You have to understand that as the director to say, okay, well, I need to really invest in the climax. That's an important part of the play. Or also, hey, this exposition, I need to make sure as the director that the audience understands this exposition, or they're not going to know who this person is. They're not going to understand why this applies later, things like that. So all of those moments should be particularly crafted, those moments, whatever they are on stage, by the director. Characters, again, this really just goes back to director-actor relationship, but also costume designer as well, making sure all three, your costume designer, the actor, and you all need to be on the same page. Is this, if the costume designer pulls a 6-inch heel and the director or the actor is like, I sort of envision them in work boots, then the three of us are not on the same page with the playwright about who that character is. So we need to make sure we have a mutual understanding. Yes, so relationships between the characters, that's vitally important. Are we creating groups? I tend to start with groups. Do we need to see that they're enemies? Are we looking at a particular family? Things like that. Objectives, again, which we visited earlier. And then power and status. Who carries power, why, things like that. Again, that's going to apply primarily to your costume, hair and makeup, and actors, folks, when you're talking to them. Okay, idea, concept. So this is really where the director comes in, because yes, again, the playwright has written a script, and the actors are making choices as their characters, and the designers are making all these great choices based on the work but it all comes back to they're making choices out of the genesis of whatever your idea or concept is as the director. So I think sometimes there's a misapprehension that concept is that it's something that you put on top of a play, or movie, whatever. But in fact, a concept, and we'll kind of look at this a little bit more later too, should actually lift out what that playwright's intention was. How can we make something that's more accessible to people now, that really speaks to this even more strongly, than it maybe was originally intended, or how can I, as the director, serve this text best? So, a bit of a hint, if you're ever, if you're the director and you're not sure, you're like, I don't know what the main idea, I don't know what the major theme of the play is. Well, that's arguably the most important part of your job. You have to know, what is the point? Why are we coming together? Why are we producing this play now? How can we tell the story most effectively? It's not just about plot. Plot without idea is empty, right? So, a great place to look, I pulled this playbill from Fences. If you're not familiar, it has also been adapted to an Oscar-winning film starring Denzel Washington and Viola Davis several years ago. And Fences by August Wilson is just a very quick overview. Is a play that was set in the 1950s in Pittsburgh around a Black family, the Maxons, who are trying to survive and make it, in the city, living off of the pay of the patriarch of the family, Troy Maxon, who is a garbage man. So when you first, so really the whole play is just about this dysfunctional family. We see how they tried to make it. We see that the conflict that they have with one another, etc. So it's all focused on this single family, on this one porch. And if you're ever struggling, so you may read the play and you may think, is this, a statement about fathers and sons? Is this a statement about wives of this time period who had to, endure sexism? You have all of these questions, right, about the thematic content. And as we know, theme is just, what's the message? What's the message here? And the first place that I like to go is sort of the quickest way, because sometimes the theme is revealed in the dialogue or in the actions that the characters take. But the place that it's most readily visible is the title. And that's why I pulled this Fences example and why I gave a very brief overview, because I want to talk about, this is just a great title to analyze, that in Fences, and even if you're not familiar with it, you can track along with me, that it's a great title because, first of all, the title is the only means by which a playwright communicates directly with, it's the only time it acknowledges us, a reader, because everything else in a play either communicates to the director or the actors. It tells them, okay, this is how you're supposed to say this line, or, these are the words of the play, or this is the action you have to take, or this is the setting. The title, however, is for us, the audience. And so it's our duty to connect to that, to, wrestle with it, to try to understand what it means. And so with Fences, in the play, the family is literally erecting a new fence. So there's a literal component to that, but it also refers to Troy is a character who is obsessed with baseball and apparently was a very successful he was a very talented baseball player who was kept potentially out of, the pros because of his race, because he was Black. But his obsession with death, he frequently anthropomorphizes death and talks about death throwing him curveballs. And so he's going to hit it over the fence, right? He's going to defy death. So the first meaning is in the literal fence that they're building. Second is, this is the obstacle I have between death. I'm going to overcome it. And I'm sure there are more than even the ones I'm listing. And then also, even already looking at those two, well, why are we having to, rebuild the fence? Oh, it's because of where we live. And is that a socioeconomic statement? Then, the pending, loom of death and those, barriers between Troy and being able to play baseball. What is the source of that? Again, we see that there's a racial component to it. And then finally, the barriers between this family surviving and thriving. So, which again are deeply racial and socioeconomic in nature. So if I were to read Fences, on a cursory glance, I may think this is just about a family, but actually if I dig a little deeper and go back and look at that title, I may discover, oh, this is actually a deeply seated, racial commentary. And that's why, again, for the director as a detective in looking at and examining plays, you have to be aware of the socio-economic and historical landscape and political landscape of the world that you're in as well, because how can I depict that in a way that people are going to connect to that today? So that was idea. You have to understand that in order to even have a successful concept. Mood and tone, similarly, how can I make sure that there's just consistency? Again, if I'm directing Fences, I want to make sure it's not comedic, but I want to be clear in the, the weight and seriousness of the tone. So, you personally don't establish that as a director in terms of you don't physically get up and do anything about it, but how do I communicate with the designers about it? How do I also move actors around on stage in a way that effectively communicates it? How do I create transitions, right? Because transitions, and that's why I said shifts are transitions. The playwright has said, hey, this is the end of the scene, and then they give you the beginning of the next scene. Well, the director, the directing really comes in at the transitions, because they have to figure out, how do we get from point A to point B? Sure, we can do a blackout and I can just move stuff on stage, but what if, and most advanced directors know to take advantage of this, how can we transition from one scene to another, have a change in time, have a change in location, and use that, whatever that transition is, to also continue to tell story, to establish tone and mood. Like if I was doing a fun children's play that was very light in tone, maybe we could have slapstick and funny things as we, move things around, versus you wouldn't want to do that in Fences, for instance. So that's a place where the director also has a lot of control. And then, again, dialogue, the director can't change, so they need to recognize stylics and languages, variations, styles, things like that to communicate effectively to actors, but again, they're not changing it. Tempo, honestly really goes back to that dramatic action analysis, making sure that that rate of action is building in a way. So that's why when you draw out that initial Freytag triangle, whatever form that takes, I want to make sure that the action progresses in a way that makes sense for this. Is it a slow burn that sort of escalates slowly over time, or is it nonstop action that's, continues to have highs and lows as we go? So whatever the play calls for, just identifying it and making sure you're giving it its proper, due course. And then finally, and again, this relates more to the designers in general, the who, what, when, where, and why of the play. And you might think that that's, I'm going to do 2 more August Wilson examples. You may think that those are really easy to identify and maybe they're not that important, but actually they're vitally important. I'm going to give 2 quick examples. First, in Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, I pulled this example because, yes, it's a stage play and also has been recently adapted into a Netflix film, and starring Viola Davis as well, actually. And in the play, the play is set at the end of a winter that won't end. And the play is very dark, literally and figuratively. It's extremely heavy play. And that never-ending winter is sort of an ominous tone over everything to say that there's not hope potentially for the characters, which is a very different takeaway than and I would need to know that if I'm producing this play, what is the playwright saying about hope? What is the play, why have they chosen the season? Versus in the Netflix film adaptation, which is almost exactly the original text, one of the few changes that was made was to make it actually hot summer. And what that did was it not only shifted it from a sort of resignated, depressed winter it changed that to a hot, excitable, frightening, but ultimately, I think, more hopeful tone overall. I was supposed to also sort of emulate the protests of the summer of 2020 as well, and looking at how racial discord in the United States has evolved over time. And so again, it's evoking that image, which connects to people differently because of the political awareness that the director had of the world. So it evokes more familiar images of that heat, of boiling over tensions. And also, again, instead of an unending winter, it says, no, that this is a time of reckoning. So very different tones just in the season. And think about the implications of that. Because the director tapped into that in terms of the idea, that means that the costumers had completely different jobs to do. That means that, so hopefully the costumer wasn't already pulling sketches for winter in Chicago. So it changes their job. The production designer changes their job. Props, because, instead of, all of the things that we would need during this time period to keep warm, we're actually trying to stay cool. So we need fans, we need feathers, so it really affects everyone on the entire process. Sound, right? And now we have cicadas maybe, or whatever else that means for us that's very different just because of something that would seem quote unquote simple, like the season. So those given circumstances are just vitally important. And a fun discovery, last quick note on Two Trains Running, also August Wilson. I was serving as a dramaturg, and I was just trying to put together, because we need to, you should always make a timeline of your play. Sometimes a play takes a course of a single day. Sometimes it's over years, millennia, right? And so you need to know specifically what is the exact day, time, as specific as you can get with the information you have. And I was having a really hard time because it was so embedded. People wouldn't say, hey, it's Tuesday. You would have to read deep into a conversation. Oh, yeah, last Thursday, or, tomorrow I'm going to go. Yesterday I went, blah, blah, blah. And then in the next scene be like, oh, hey, remember 2 days ago when I said, and you're like, oh, okay. So we start putting it together. And I realized the whole play was over the course of one complete week, and realized that it was a creation. It was evoking creation myth. and the creation of the earth, based in Christian tradition of the 6 days and then on the seventh of rest. So that was a huge discovery for those depictions for the director. And okay, do we want to tell that story? How do we include that? So it made a very big difference to what we focused on in those scenes and what that religious imagery did for the interpretation for, again, everyone who was working on it. So this is like the majority of part one. Part two is much smaller. But the main takeaway right now is that directors use their brain. That they need to be very cerebral. Again, like I said, they are essentially detectives who are excavating these plays and trying to understand them from the inside out. So we're going to end up on these functions. So what exactly are they responsible for is sort of the question that's raised. Like, okay, I see that they do this analysis. They know the text backwards and forwards. I see some of the paperwork that they do to understand it best. I understand that they talk to everyone, but what do they actually on a day-to-day do? The great question. That's split into two parts. So the first part, and we've already been talking about it, is the preparation. So what do, if I'm a director and I'm starting to work on a production, there's a lot of work that I do before I even meet with anyone. Or, before we even cast, right? There's a lot of conversations that have to happen because it's a long process, months. And then, so preparation is 90% of it. And then production is the other, 10 to 20%, really. And production is where we think of directors. We think of directors being in the room with actors, telling them what to do or, talking to them. But actually, so much of what they do happens before that. So we'll just go through and look at each of these individually. First, play selection. Again, this is where the theater history, where the canon familiarity, where socioeconomic and historical and political landscape understanding is so relevant, because a director needs to have a personal connection to the material that they're producing. Why do I specifically want to tell this story? And also going back to your chapter about the critic. So the critic is, and not just a professional critic, but also audience members. What do they want to see on stage right now? What are they going to connect to? What has artistic merit? What is entertaining? And what is socially significant about the world that I'm in? So once they select that, then it's time to develop the concept. So, and I know we visited this a little bit. So concept really just means trying to extract what is the idea that the playwright is trying to communicate. And again, that this really comes from an understanding both of an intimate understanding of the play and also what it means to a modern audience. Because and we're going to look in this example, what an audience may have seen hundreds of years ago, even with the exact same text without changing a single syllable, could have a completely different meaning today. When it comes to gender roles, when it comes to race, when it comes, to age even. There's so many different things, ability, so many things that have evolved with a cultural lens and will always evolve. And that's why theater, it's of the time. It's ephemeral. It's not like film that's captured forever. So in this example, we see these are two different pictures of, depictions, I guess I should say, of Romeo and Juliet. And so the left, we might think of that as the more traditional approach, this historically accurate garb, two fair-skinned, lovers of Verona. And if you ever read Romeo and Juliet, it's just about two young star-crossed lovers who fall in love even though they are from warring families who do not approve of their union. And in their pursuit of love, they both die. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the quick version. However, and it's funny because we could look at the second image on the right and think, oh, this is more modern. This, has a social or political statement to it. But in fact, if we think about it, the left image would actually be, if this were what was being depicted on stage, far more socially impertinent than what we see on the right. Because women couldn't be actors in Shakespeare's day. They legally weren't allowed. And so you shouldn't be seeing women on stage even when romance was being depicted, right? So even though it's on paper a heterosexual relationship, it was depicted on stage at the time as, as two men. And so it's again, these are ideas that are always evolving.